Chapter 10, End of our critical treatments. 57 queries regarding readily formed misunderstandings of our logical endeavors. Our investigations up to this point have been predominantly critical. We have, we think, established the untenability of any form of empiricistic or psychologistic logic, whatever its character. Logic in the sense of a methodology of science has its main foundations outside of psychology. The idea of a pure logic, a theoretical science independent of everything empirical, and hence also of psychology, a science which first renders possible a technology of scientific knowledge which logic in the theoretical practical sense is, must be admitted as sound, and the indispensable task of its independent construction must be tackled seriously. May we content ourselves with these results, and may we hope to see them recognized as results. The logic of our time, so sure of its success, so much worked upon by such important thinkers, and so widely recognized, will not readily be admitted to be treading vain paths of futile endeavor. One idealistic criticism may awaken displeasure where problems of principle are discussed, but a mere glance at the proud array of important works from Mill to Erdmann and Lopes will be enough to re-establish most people's shaken confidence. It will be said that there must be some way of resolving the arguments and bringing them into harmony with the content of our flourishing science. If this is not so, one may be dealing with a merely epistemological transvaluation of that science, which, even if important, will not have the revolutionary result of destroying its essential content. At most it will be a question of conceiving many things more precisely, of suitably limiting some careless statements, or altering the order of one's investigations. There is perhaps something really to be said for keeping a few propositions of pure logic together in their purity, and separating them off from the empirical psychological statements of logical technology. Such reflections will satisfy many who feel the force of our idealistic arguments, without having the courage to draw the necessary conclusions. The radical transformation which logic, in the sense of our conception, must necessarily undergo, might further encounter mistrust and antipathy, since it might readily appear, superficially regarded, to be a case of pure reaction. That this is not our intention, that our reattachment to the justified trends of older philosophies does not aim at the restoration of traditional logic, should surely have emerged from a close study of the content of our analyses. We can scarcely hope, however, that such indications will overcome all mistrust, and will guard against the misreading of our intentions. 58 Our links with great thinkers of the past and, in the first place, with Kant that we are in a position to appeal to the authority of great thinkers like Kant, Herbart and Lotz, and, before these, to Leibniz, will not help us. It may even help to strengthen mistrust against us. We are led back, in the most general terms, to Kant's distinction between pure and applied logic. We may indeed approve of his most notable utterances on this point, but only with suitable provisos. We shall naturally not accept Kant's confusing, mythic concepts of understanding and reason, by which he sets such store, and which he uses in such questionable demarcations, as being, in a proper sense, faculties of the soul. Understanding or reason, as the dispositions of a certain normal thought attitude, presuppose pure logic, which defines normality, in their concept. If we therefore have serious recourse to them, we shall be no wiser than if, in like case, we try to explain the art of dancing by the dancing faculty, i.e. the faculty of dancing artfully, the art of painting by the painting faculty, etc. We rather take the terms understanding and reason as merely indicating a direction to the form of thinking and its ideal laws, which logic, as opposed to an empirical psychology of knowledge, must follow. After such reservations, interpretations, closer qualifications, we accordingly feel close to Kant's doctrine. Must such an agreement not have the effect of compromising our concept of logic? Pure logic, which in truth is alone science, ought, according to Kant, to be brief and dry, as is required by the scholastic exposition of a theory of the elements of the understanding. Critique of Pure Reason, Introduction to T.R. Logic, 1 of 54/B78. Everyone is familiar with Kant's lectures, published by Chask, and knows to what a questionable extent they fulfill this characteristic demand. Shall this unutterably defective logic be the model we should strive to imitate? No one will look kindly on the thought of pushing science back to the standpoint of the Aristotelian scholastic logic, which seems what Kant's treatment amounts to, since he himself says that logic has had the character of a closed science since the time of Aristotle. A scholastic elaboration of syllogistics, prefaced by some solemnly pronounced conceptual definitions, is surely no inspiring program. To this we should of course reply that the fact that we feel ourselves more akin to Kant's conception of logic than to that of, say, Mill or Sigwart, does not mean that we approve of its complete content, nor of the particular manner in which Kant has worked out his idea of a pure logic. We agree with Kant in his main drift, though we do not find that he clearly espied the essence of his intended discipline, nor set it forth in accordance with its adequate content. 59 Links with Herbart and Lotz. We are closer to Herbart than to Kant, particularly so because he sharply stresses one cardinal point, and makes explicit use of it in distinguishing pure logic from psychology. This is indeed the crucial point which decides the matter, the objectivity of the concept, of the presentation in the sense of pure logic. Everything thought of, Herbart says in, for example, his main work on psychology, Psychologie als Wissenschaft, 2, 120, is, qualitatively treated, a concept in the sense of logic. In this connection nothing relates to the thinking subject, to which concepts can only be attributed in a psychological sense, whereas the concept of man, of triangle etc., is no one's property. Each concept in its logical meaning is in fact only once present, which could not be the case if the number of concepts increased with the number of subjects conceiving them, or even with the number of distinct acts of thinking through which, psychologically speaking, a concept is produced and brought forth. The INCR of the traditional philosophers, even those of Wolff, we read on in the same paragraph, are merely concepts in the logical sense. The old proposition essentia rerum sunt immutabiles belongs here. It merely means that concepts are wholly timeless things, which is true of them in all their logical relationships, in consequence of which the scientific propositions and syllogisms that they form are and remain true for the ancients as for us, and in heaven as on earth. But concepts in this sense, in which they are a common knowledge for all men and epochs, are nothing psychological. Psychologically a concept is a presentation which has the logically understood concept as its presentatum. It is that through which the latter, the thing to be presented, really is presented. In this sense everyone certainly has his own concepts. Archimedes investigated his own concept of a circle, and Newton likewise his own. These were two concepts in the sense of psychology, though logically there was only one concept for all mathematicians. Similar statements are made in section 2 of his Lehrbuch Einleitung in die Philosophie, 34, p. 77. The very first sentence runs, all our thoughts can be dealt with from two sides, as activities of mind and as regards what is thought through them. In the latter respect we call them concepts. This word, meaning what is conceived, enjoins abstraction from the manner in which we receive, produce or reproduce thoughts. In 35 Herbart denies that two concepts can be exactly alike, for they would then not differ in respect of what is thought by them, and not therefore as concepts at all. As against this, the thinking of one and the same concept can be often repeated, produced and recalled on very different occasions, performed by countless rational beings, without thereby making the concept many. He warns us in a note to keep in mind that concepts are neither real objects nor real acts of thinking. The second error is still alive. Many accordingly make of logic a natural history of the understanding, and think they recognize in logic the understanding's innate laws and forms of thought, thereby corrupting psychology. One can, if need be, prove by a complete induction, he remarks in another passage, that not one of all the doctrines which belong indisputably to logic, from the oppositions and subordinations of concepts to syllogistic rights, presupposes anything psychological. The whole of pure logic has to do with relations of what is thought, of the content of our presentations, though not specifically with this content itself. Nowhere does it deal with the activity of thinking, or with the psychological or metaphysical possibility of such thinking. Applied logic, like applied ethics, first requires psychological knowledge, insofar as the character of the material must be discussed that one desires to shape to the prescriptions given. Psycho/Elsewis. 119. In this regard, we find many instructive and important pronouncements which modern logic has rather pushed aside than seriously considered. Our link up with Herbart's authority must not, however, be misunderstood. It does not at all mean a return to the idea and mode of treatment of logic which Herbart envisaged, and which his worthy pupil Trubische so eminently carried out. Herbart certainly had great merits, particularly in the respect mentioned above, his emphasis on the ideality of the concept. Even his formation of the concept deserves praise, whether one agrees with his terminology or not. On the other hand, however, Herbart seems to me never to have risen above quite isolated, immature suggestions, many misguided but, alas, very influential thoughts, thoroughly distorted his best intentions. It was a pity that Herbart failed to notice the fundamental ambiguity of expressions like content, what is presented, what is thought of. On one hand, they stand for the ideal, self-same meaning content of the corresponding expressions, on the other hand, for the varying presented objects. Herbart, as far as I can see, never said the one thing that could clear up the concept of a concept, that a concept or presentation in the logical sense is nothing but the self-identical meaning of the corresponding expressions. Herbart's basic mistake was more important. He located what is essential to the ideality of the logical concept in its normality, thus shifting the sense of true, genuine ideality, of unified meaning, into the dispersed multiplicity of experiences. The fundamental sense of ideality, which puts an unbridgeable gulf between ideal and real, is thereby lost, and the notion of normality which is substituted for it, confuses the basic conceptions of logic. Compare on this point the study which concerns the unity of the species in the present work. Closely connected with this error is Herbart's belief that he has found a saving formula when he opposes logic as the morals of thought to psychology as the natural history of the understanding, Lehrbach der Psychology, 180. Of the pure, theoretic science which underlies such morals, and likewise underlies morals in the ordinary sense, he has no idea, and still less of the extent and natural boundaries of this science, and of its intimate unity with pure mathematics. In this respect therefore, Herbart's logic deserves the reproach of poverty, just as do the logics of Kant and Aristotle and the schoolmen. Superior as in other respects it shows itself in virtue of its practice of independent, exact research within its narrow circle. Linked up with this fundamental mistake, is the error of Herbart's theory of knowledge. It shows a complete inability to recognize the apparently profound problem of the harmony of the subjective course of logical thinking with the real course of external actuality, for what it is, and for what we shall later show it to be, a pseudo-problem bred by unclarity. All this is true of the logicians in Herbart's sphere of influence, and especially of Lotz, who took up many of Herbart's suggestions, thought them out penetratingly, and carried them further with originality. We owe him a great deal, but regrettably find that even his fine approaches are brought to naught by his Herbartian confusion between specific and normative ideality. His great logical work, rich as it is in original thoughts, all worthy of a great thinker, hereby becomes a jarring mixture of psychologism and pure logic. 260 links with Leibniz. Leibniz was mentioned above as one of the great philosophers to whom our present conception of logic looks back. Our relation to him is relatively of the closest. Herbart's logical opinions, likewise, are only closer to ours than Kant's, to the extent that Herbart, as against Kant, revived Leibnizian ideas. But Herbart proved himself incapable even of an approximate exhaustion of all the valuable material to be found in Leibniz. He lags far behind the conceptions of the mighty thinker, for whom mathematics and logic form a single science. These conceptions stir a particular sympathy in us, and deserve a few words. The driving motive which set modern philosophy going, the idea of the completion and transformation of the sciences, inspired Leibniz too to work unremittingly on a reformed logic. More penetrating than his predecessors, he did not heap scorn on scholastic logic as empty, formal rubbish, but saw in it a valuable step towards the true logic, which could truly help thought despite its incompleteness. See, for example, Leibniz's elaborate defense of traditional logic, although it is hardly a shadow of logic as he would wish it, in his letter to Wagner, Opera Philosophica, Erdmann, 418 ff. The development of this logic into a discipline of mathematical form and strictness, into a universal mathematic in the highest and most comprehensive sense is the goal towards which his efforts are continually devoted. I here follow the indications in Nouveau Essays, Book 4, Chapter XVN. Compare for example 4, Opera Philosophica, Erdmann, 395, where the doctrine of syllogistic forms, extended into a quite general doctrine of arguments en form, is called unispista mathematic universal. Don't, importance enist pars assez connu. Tu faut savoir, he says there, Q par J's arguments en form J en entens par sulement set manière scholastique the argumenta, don't on cert dans J's colleges, meist haut raison niemand qui complat par la force de la forme, it oul on en besoin de supple or qu'un article, de sorte question un strites, un autre tissue de syllogisme, qui évite la répétition, mean un can't be en dress, un calcul de algebra, unanalyse des infinitesimals me seront plus pres des arguments en forme, puis low form. De raison et prédominantry, en sorte question ou ist certa nesy point tromper. The sphere of the mathematic universal here conceived would also be very much wider than that of the logical calculus to whose construction Leibniz devoted great pains, without quite reaching its boundaries. Leibniz ought rightly to have included in this universal mathematics the whole mathesis universalis in the usual quantitative sense, which constitutes the narrowest of Leibniz's concepts of mathesis universalis, especially since he had repeatedly called pure mathematical arguments argumenta in forma even in other contexts. The ars combinatoria, su speciosa genera forward / su doctrina de formis abstracta, compare the mathematical writings in Pertz's edition, volume 7, pp 24, 49 ff, 54, 159, 205 ff, should also likewise have been included in universal mathematics. It forms the fundamental part of mathesis universalis in a wider sense, though not in the above widest sense, while mathesis universalis is distinguished from logic as a subordinate territory. Leibniz defines his ars combinatoria, Pertz, 7, p. 61, which is of particular interest to us, as doctrina de formulis suordinis, similitudinis, relationis, etc. expressionibus in universum. It is here opposed as scientia generalista qualitate to the scientia generalista quantitate, which is universal mathematics in the ordinary sense. Compare with this the valuable passage in Berhardt's edition of Leibniz's philosophical writings, volume vn, p. 297f, ars combinatoria speciatim nihila est scientia, qua etiam generalita characteristica siv speciosa dici possit, in qua tractata de rerum formis siv formulis in universum, hoc ist de qualitate ingenia, siv de simili et dissimili, praut aleriat aleri formuli ex ipsis a, b, c etc, siv quantitate siv alude quidam reprise intent, inter se combinatis orienta, it. Distinguiture AB algebra qua agit de formulis ad quantitatem applicatis, civ de equaliat inequali. Igito algebra subordinatia combinatorii, eius gregulis continue utita, qual tamen long generalia res sunt, ni in algebra tantum sed in art decifratoria, in veritas luderam generibus, in its geometri lineariter ad veteram morem tractata, denic in omnibus ubi similitudinis ratio habita locum habent. The intuitions of Leibniz, which speed forth so far beyond their time, seem sharply defined and highly admirable to a modern acquainted with formal mathematics and mathematical logic. This applies also, I must expressly note, to Leibniz's fragments on scientia genera forward slashes or the calculus ratiocinata, in which Trendelenburg's elegant but superficial criticism could pick out so little that was of use. Historis Beatriae of Philosophy, Volume M. Leibniz likewise points, in repeated, express pronouncements, to the need to widen logic so as to include a mathematical theory of probabilities. He demands of mathematicians an analysis of the problems which lie hidden in games of chance, and expects great resultant advances in empirical thinking, and the logical criticism of it. 3. Leibniz, in short, had intuitions of genius. He foresaw the most splendid gains which logic has had to register since the time of Aristotle, the theory of probabilities and mathematical analyses of syllogistic and non-syllogistic arguments. The latter first matured in the second half of the 19th century. Through his combinatoria he is also the intellectual father of the pure theory of manifolds, a discipline close to pure logic and in fact intimately one with it, compare below 69-70. In all this Leibniz bases himself on the same idea of pure logic as we here support. Nothing is further from him than to think that the essential foundations of a fruitful art of knowledge could be found in psychology. They are for him altogether a priori. They constitute a discipline mathematical in form, which as such, just like, for example pure arithmetic, immediately includes a vocation for the practical regulation of knowledge. 461 Need for special investigations to provide an epistemological justification and partial realization of the idea of pure logic. The authority of Leibniz must, however, count even less for us than that of Kant or Herbart, since he could not give to his great intentions the weight of completed achievements. He belongs to a past age, beyond which modern science feels that it has traveled a long way. Authorities do not in fact carry much weight as opposed to the broad advance of a science supposedly rich and secure in its results. Their influence must be less, insofar as they lack a sufficiently clarified, positively elaborated concept of the discipline in question. Clearly, if we do not want to stick halfway, and to run the risk that our critical reflections may be barren, we must take up the task of constructing the idea of pure logic on a sufficiently broad basis. Only in a series of meaty individual treatments, which will provide a more precise idea of the content and character of the essential logical researches, and which will work out the notion of logic more definitely, can one remove the prejudice which sees logic as an insignificant field of more or less trivial statements. As against this, we shall see that our discipline extends far and wide, not merely in respect of its content of systematic theories, but above all in regard to the difficult and important investigations needed for its philosophical foundation and assessment. But even the putative triviality of the field of purely logical truths would in itself be no argument for its treatment as a mere aid towards a logical technology. The interests of pure theory require us to treat what constitutes a unified whole of theory in a theoretically closed manner, and not as a mere aid towards external ends. Our investigations so far have, we hope, made plain that a correct grasp of the essence of pure logic, and of its unique position in relation to all other sciences, is one of the most important questions in the whole of epistemology. If this is plain, it is likewise of vital interest to this fundamental philosophical science, that pure logic should be fully expounded in purity and independence. Epistemology must, of course, not be taken to be a discipline following upon or coinciding with metaphysics, but one which precedes metaphysics, as it precedes psychology and all other disciplines. Appendix references to F. Long and 8. Bolzano widens is the gulf which divides my logic from F. Lang's. I am in agreement with him, and regard him as having done the discipline a service, in that, in a period when pure logic was mainly despised, he definitely stood out for the view that science may expect important advances from attempts at a separate treatment of the purely formal elements of logic. Logikstudien, P1. Our agreement extends further. In the most general features it also applies to the idea of the discipline, which Lang could not indeed bring to essential clarity. He has good grounds for regarding the hiving off of pure logic as the hiving off of the doctrines which he calls the apodeictic element in logic, i.e. the doctrines which, like mathematical theorems, can be developed in an absolutely cogent manner. His next remarks are well worth remembering. The mere fact of the presence of cogent truths is so important, that every trace of such truths must be carefully followed up. To omit such an investigation on account of the small value of formal logic, or its inadequacy as a theory of human thought, would have to be rejected from this point of view as a confusion of theoretical with practical aims. Such an objection would be as if a chemist refused to analyze a compound because in its compounded state it was very valuable, whereas its single constituents were unlikely to have any value. Opposite P7F, he is just as right in another passage. Formal logic as an apodeictic science, has a value totally independent of its validity. Every system of truths which hold a priori, deserves the highest respect. Opposite P127. While Lang warmly supported the idea of a purely formal logic, he had no notion that this idea had already been realized to a relatively high degree. I am of course not referring to the many expositions of formal logic, which flourished especially in the schools of Kant and Herbart, and which did so little to live up to their own claims. I am referring to Bernhard Bolzano's Wissenschaftslehre, published in 1837, a work which, in its treatment of the logical theory of elements, far surpasses everything that world literature has to offer in the way of a systematic sketch of logic. Bolzano did not, of course, expressly discuss or support any independent demarcation of pure logic in our sense, but he provided one de facto in the first 2 volumes of his work. In his discussions of what underlay a Wissenschaftslehre or theory of science in the sense of his conception, he did so with such purity and scientific strictness, and with such a rich store of original, scientifically confirmed and ever fruitful thoughts, that we must count him as one of the greatest logicians of all time. He must be placed historically in fairly close proximity to Leibniz, with whom he shares important thoughts and fundamental conceptions, and to whom he is also philosophically akin in other respects. Even he, however, did not quite exhaust the rich inspiration of Leibniz's logical intuitions, especially not in regard to mathematical syllogistics and to mathesis universalis. Too few of Leibniz's posthumous writings were, however, known at the time, and there was no formal mathematics or theory of manifolds to provide a key to their understanding. In each line of his wonderful book, Bolzano shows himself to be an acute mathematician, who lets the same spirit of scientific strictness rule in logic which he himself first introduced into the theoretical treatment of the basic concepts and propositions of mathematical analysis, which thereby acquired a new foundation. For this the history of mathematics has not forgotten to grant him a famous place. Of the ambiguous profundity of that systematic philosophy, which rather aimed at thinking out world conceptions and a world wisdom, and which hindered the progress of scientific philosophy so badly by its unholy blend of discordant intentions, Bolzano, the contemporary of Hegel, shows no trace. His thought patterns are of mathematical straightforwardness and plainness, but also of mathematical clearness and strictness. Only when one has gone more deeply into the sense and aim of these patterns throughout the whole discipline, does one find what great mental work and achievement lie hidden behind plain statements and formularized expositions. To philosophers bred in the prejudices, in the thought and speech habits of the idealistic schools, not all of us have completely outgrown such influences. Such a scientific approach readily seems shallow and void of ideas, as well as ponderous and pedantic. Logic as a science must, however, be built upon Bolzano's work, and must learn from him its need for mathematical acuteness in distinctions, for mathematical exactness in theories. It will then reach a new standpoint for judging the mathematicizing theories of logic, which mathematicians, quite unperturbed by philosophic scorn, are so successfully constructing. These theories altogether conform to the spirit of Bolzano's logic, though Bolzano had not an inkling of them. It will at least be impossible for a future historian of logic to be so wrong as the otherwise thorough Hipperweg, who treats a work of the rank of the Wissenschaftler on a level with Nig's Logic for Females, Logic für Frauenzimmer. 5 Much as Bolzano's achievement is cast in one piece, it cannot be regarded, as such a deeply honest thinker would be the first to admit, as in any way final. To mention only one point, one particularly feels his defects in epistemological directions. There are either no investigations, or else only quite insufficient ones, which give genuine philosophical intelligibility to logical thought achievements, and so provide a philosophical estimate of logic as a discipline. Such questions can be evaded by a thinker who, like a mathematician, is building theories upon theories, without having to bother himself about questions of underlying principle. They cannot be evaded by someone who undertakes to make clear, to those who either fail to see or to admit a discipline's validity, or who mix up essential tasks with quite heterogeneous ones, what the inherent justification of such a discipline really is, and what the nature of its tasks and objects may be. Our comparison of these present logical investigations with Bolzano's work is meant to make clear, not that our investigations are in any sense mere commentaries upon, or critically improved expositions of, Bolzano's thought patterns, but that they have been crucially stimulated by Bolzano, as also by Lotz.